welcome back to I've Walked in Your Shoes. Thanks for joining us. I want to thank everyone that watched the last episode. And I had said we were going to be discussing this episode on going further on the why we're doing what we're doing and why I was wanting to do this podcast. But in order to go forward, I think we need to go back. For those that don't know me, for those that don't know Jose Antonio Cabrera, Tony, that grew up with me, I think it's a little history lesson. How I grew up. I actually grew up in church, grew up going to Truth Church, grew up in Pentecost. My mom and dad religiously would take us to church, my brother and I, and my mom and dad, my grandma, my aunt, my cousins. It would be Wednesdays. At that time, it was Saturdays as well. Fridays Spanish service, and then Sunday and Sunday evening. So yeah, that's how I grew up, was attending church. And then not only did I attend church, the Truth Church itself had a Christian school that we were part of. That's where most of my education was done, all the way till grade 10 or 11. I don't recall. I think 11. But, so, yeah, here we are. My initial experience, because you're young and you're growing up in it, and your parents are taking you, and you go with the flow. You go with what your parents wanted you to do. But as you grow older, it's definitely a choice that you make, depending how involved you are, how I don't even know how to put this, but devout, yes, how devout you are. Just in my experience growing up, it was not really the best thing in my eyes for me. I wasn't the best kid, let's say. Well, I don't know. I wasn't the worst kid either, but for example, sometimes I went with the flow. If someone had an idea of let's go do this, and I wouldn't think about it, I would just follow along. Okay, let's go. That would end with a lot of the times with me in trouble, and part of that would be something that's called disfellowship in the church organization, and that is where pretty much they'll stand you in front of the whole church and say what you did wrong, and pretty much just embarrass you in front of everyone. Say that you can't talk to anyone your age. It was, for me, it was from going from school, home, and then to church, home, and I could only talk to people that were older than me at that time. So yeah, that was part of my growing up. I'm not going to blame anyone for that. I'm just going to say that I didn't like to learn my lesson, I guess. My parents were strict as well. They grew up in the church, and the strictness of the church is what they followed as well. But yeah, it's just how I grew up. So in my later years, like in my teens, seeing how if I did something, and even though I wasn't the one to come up with the idea or begin it, I'd get in trouble. I was like, you know what, this isn't for me, right? This is just not for me. My heart wasn't into it anymore. My mind was not into it. And also some of the friends that I had growing up had already left Truth Church. So of course, as a teenager, you start to rebel against your parents, and you start to rebel against what you've learned, and you want to follow those cool kids, for example. But yeah, as I grew up into later in my teen years, I told my parents I did not want to go to the Christian school anymore. I wanted to go to public school, which they fought me on it, but it was, I guess I'll just pack my bags and go. And I remember when that happened and how upset but hurt I had hurt, how much I'd hurt my parents, how much I'd hurt my mom and dad. I remember that. Yeah, just for everything that they tried to instill in me, and I don't blame them for any of that. It was all my own doing. Is just you just want to get away from. It always seemed like it was just everything was no, right? So I've found out, like, even as an adult now, that a lot of the times when you tell someone no, 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 you can't do this, no, don't do that, they're gonna go and do it, right? So, and that was me. That was me. My dad would say, don't do it, you're gonna end up hurt. Don't do it, you're gonna end up with a broken heart. Don't do it, you're gonna, it's nothing as good is going to come of it. And of course not. I'd have to go, right, and check it out myself. And most of the time my dad was 100% right. Right, until you smacked your head and or hurt yourself or broken heart. Then it was exactly as my parents had told me. Yeah, and as once I started high school, once I started grade 11, I believe, in public school, everything just started to change. Like, you start to get away from the things that you're taught. You start to get away from the things of God. You start to get away from those values, for example, that you've been taught. But one thing that I always carried with me is I knew what I had believed in. I knew what I believed in. I knew what I'd been taught. That's one thing. I can say that I hadn't completely lost all my belief and all my morals and all my, right? But the saying goes, I don't even remember the saying, but it's, tell me who you're with and I'll tell you, something like that.
I don't know. This is not a saying.
It is. It's in Spanish. It's dime con quién andas y te diré quién eres.
In English, it's I don't know.
Pretty much, it's about who you're with influences who you become, right? So that's where Jose Antonio Cabrera sort of started to go downhill from there, because you start to do things that
now I understand.
you're not
so
supposed
Tony
to.
is the ego, and Jose is the alter ego, because Tony came first. Now it makes sense.
Ay. But anyways, now I lost my train of thought. But yeah, that's where I think that's as I've grown older, as I'm older now, and I look back at my life, that's where I find that's where it started to go downhill. Because from there, it becomes, Joe, I just want to hang out with my friends. I want to be with my friends. I don't want to go to church on this day. I don't want to go to church on that day. No, but I'm going to go here to, my friends offered me a beer, or my friends offered me a cigarette, or my friends offered me this. So, like, slowly, gradually, especially in your teen years, right, you're rebelling, everything that your parents and churches taught you, your pastors taught you. It's like, no, it just don't. You're trying to get away from it all. Only, I think, in reality, it's just to rebel against what they want you to do. At least for me, that's what I look back at now that I'm an adult, and I see my kids, and when I tell them no on something, and that they just still go and do it, or they talk back about doing it, I can see why it would hurt my mom and dad, because as an adult now, it does. There is a hurt when your kids rebel against you or don't want to do what you've asked them to do. Oh, yeah. Just as the years went by, kind of came back to church, but not really. Just I was there for the motion of things. Let's say I was just there to to make my parents happy. And then right after I graduated, my parents decided to move back to El Salvador. And it was a shocker for us because my dad had said he was going to pay for college for me if I graduated, which I did. And yeah, I was underage when I graduated, and I had to go with my parents to El Salvador. And so there's me already upset at the world and at them and at church and all the rules. And there's me mad at now we're having to move to somewhere that I've never lived in, right? So it was worse, I think. It didn't really help me in the end. It didn't really help with, if there was any chance of me going back to church then, that wasn't it. That wasn't happening. I got into El Salvador, and yes, my dad took to pastor a church there, but like what he'd learned at Truth Church and how strict it was and how all the rules and regulations that they had, he tried to implement in the church in El Salvador, which is a bit different, I think. Just a lot of the people were, yeah, new pastor, yay, new, right? It's going to be good. And then they were like, nope, no, thank you. Don't need all these rules. Who's going to want to wear long sleeves in a tropical country, right? Or just simple rules, but my dad would implement, because that's what he was taught, right? That's what he learned. So, and he wanted to implement the same rules that he learned. And but yeah, I don't know. I learned from my dad many things, but one of them was, if something doesn't work, you got to find what works. You got to, even if you have to just change yourself, change something here, change something there in order for it to work, you make it work. And that's what my dad started to do. And then he started to be successful in his ministerial work. And they were there for quite some time. But like I said, going back to me, I stopped going to church and I started seeing my first wife, which I don't have anything bad to say about that part.
But the relationship worked well considering she was your first wife.
But, jeez. Something beautiful came of that, which is my daughter, Anaí. I love her to bits, and she's in El Salvador still. She's successful. She's a university graduate. But yeah, it turned into me just not wanting to be at church there either. And I remember I was just done with El Salvador. I couldn't. First off, a third world country, you're trying to raise a family because we found out Wendy was pregnant, and you're not I think if I remember correctly, at that time, $165 a year is what you were making. US, $165 a year is what, for the job that I had. And the job I had, I was working for Caterpillar. I was just pretty much a parts guy. Whenever they came in looking for a part, I'd be looking for that part in the warehouse. And from there, it just, I don't know. I was miserable. You know what? You're making pennies. You have a wife that is pregnant, and you're not making ends meet. And so I started seeing if I could head back to Canada. And then my uncle Ricardo was living in New York at the time, and he's like, why don't you come out here? And I was all over that. So packed my stuff and away I went to New York, to Long Island, New York, and actually started working there right away. I knew the language. If you know the English language and you're Spanish, you're well off, especially if you speak it with no accent. That's what I found out. Just and I actually started working in a warehouse, and from there met some guys, and just they introduced me to one of their bosses, and that's where I picked up sanding and refinishing in Long Island, New York, and that's my was my bread and butter for the longest time. But yeah, so getting back to when I said you start to go downhill. So I was already in a not so great place when I left El Salvador. I just wasn't, church wasn't for me. I was rebelling. And then when you go to a place like New York and you meet friends and you meet people that become friends, sorry, and you start hanging out with the wrong crowd. You start hanging out with,
you meet the corruption
comes
with those
yes,
not so good friends.
yes, you meet the corruption. You meet the everything that you thought you wouldn't get into when you first started that. When you had that first beer, let's say, when you had that first cigarette, and you say, "Oh, I'll never get to that point. I'll never get to that point where I'll never be running from the law, or I'll never be a drunk driver, or I'll never be," you name it. That's
Never's a lot closer than
yes. And then I went from arriving in New York pretty much just, I was still an honest person. I didn't know much about any of the ins and outs of other things in the world, right? I'd had a beer here and there. That was it. I wasn't much of a drinker. I'd had a cigarette here and there. I wasn't much of a smoker. I'd never gone to club parties, none of that, until I got to New York. And then from there, it just became an everyday thing. Like, you wanted to be one of those popular kids. That's what it's fun, right? It's just the beer, the drinking, the women, the money. It's just, it captivates you. And from there, just because you want to become even more, let's say, popular, you start doing things that most of the time, back when before you went to El Salvador, before you started rebelling, that's something that you would never have crossed your mind. But then now that you're in the ends, for example, just, oh yeah, everyone's loving you. You're spitting out money, you're buying rounds, you're doing all this, right? Then everyone's loving you, of course. Then you start to dive deeper. And unfortunately, something I'm not proud of is I actually became part of a gang in New York. And I know that a lot of people won't know who they are, but a lot of people will know who they are. But we'll just leave it at that. Yeah. And something that people always talked about, especially in El Salvador, when I was in El Salvador, they were always talking about this gang, and I was like, oh no, I'm never gonna be like them. Oh no, I'll never be in that gang. Oh no, that's the lowest of the low. Those guys are scum, right? But the more you go into sin, the more you go into the attractions of sin, and the more you get into it, the more you don't even see yourself changing, it seems. You you don't really see yourself changing.
Because all the people that you're around are the same.
Yes. Until you hit rock bottom. And another thing I'm not proud of is I've hit rock bottom in my life a few times. But like that teenager when I was rebelling against my dad and my mom and the pastor, I'd get up and rebel again, and I'd just go and hit my head again until I get back up, right? Just I wouldn't learn my lesson for is what it really was, right? You just yeah, and I remember hitting rock bottom the first time, and it was not pretty. But at the same time, you're so deep in the mud and the grime of all the poop that you're doing, the crap that you're doing, and then just you can't get out. It's tough to get out until you actually realize who it is, or actually you already know what it is, because that deep down in my heart, I just remember that I would go to church with my Uncle Ricardo here and there, and I know that if I went to church, right, especially when I was hitting rock bottom, if I went to church, that sometimes would just pick me up, is the words that I would say. It just, right, just gives you that boost of energy. But I think we all know that it's actually further from that. There was always a grandma praying for me. There was always a dad praying for me. There was always a mom praying for me. And they'd let me know every time I talked to them. And you as someone that have left church, that maybe you're wallowing in the mud, just remember there's always someone praying for you. There's always someone praying for you. You might just seem like there's no coming back from what you've been, what you've done. I'm here to tell you today that there is coming back. There's a God that forgives you. Because I was Jose Antonio the drunk, Jose Antonio the drug addict, Jose Antonio the womanizer, Jose Antonio the gangbanger, Jose Antonio the drug runner. But by His grace, I'm where I'm at today, where I'm supposed to be today. And Amanda and I were actually talking about recently why it had to be her to get sick, for her to have cancer. And I just started right away, to look into it, and I told her, babe, because I think if it was supposed to be me, or if it had been me that got cancer, I wouldn't have looked towards the church. I would not have looked towards God. That would not have been where I would look for my support. And I'm like, I think that's the reason, is because you asked for the support, because you wanted the support, and because Amanda's a strong woman. She does things herself. She doesn't need support. There's things that's like water off her back, but for her to ask ask for support and for her to want to go to church, I saw it was, as much as I joke around about it, I saw that it was her she was needing that. So I think that I've come to realize that, and I tell her I'm so sorry that it had to be you for us to come to God, for me to come back to God, and for Amanda to come to God. That I'm sorry that it had to be you. But I don't know how to put it, but this was all pre-planned. This was all written. This was all ahead of time. God knew what he was doing, because one thing that Amanda was not a fan of was church.
Especially Truth Church.
Especially Truth Church, but
Was scary.
yes, for her not growing up in church, and for her not really going to church, she'd go to Cowboy Church. Yeah, Truth Church was scary to her, so that was not ideal. But look at her now. She's one of the ones that goes religiously. Sometimes like I'm after work, I'm feeling just exhausted. I'm sore, especially
so he
real.
lays on the couch while I go to church.
Bro. Really? That's not even cool. But that's not true. But wow. So yeah, that's what this episode was about, is just letting people know, like, I didn't just, because I started talking about Truth Church right away in the first episode, and it was like, well, I should have maybe done this part first. But just when I wanted to do this podcast just to answer questions, I felt that one was, that's what was on my heart. This one I wrestled with so much, and I don't even know why. I wanted to go a different route, and then I had even we had started our little script. Well, not script, because I don't really follow script, but plan, like, our talking points, and then I jumped around a couple times, but I just felt that this was important, for you guys to know that what I came from. I started in Pentecost, and I got away from it. But don't ever think that you're too far gone. Don't ever think that God isn't great enough. Don't ever think that that's the end. It's not the end, and I'm here to tell you that it's not. I'm praying for you. I love you. Thanks for watching.